Hi everyone, welcome to Goth Nick and Goth Chick, the podcast where we discuss all things Gothic in media. I'm your host, Nick Vanderwaard.
I'm co-host Lindsay Wheeler.
Today we'll be discussing terror and horror as per the Radcliffean model. We'll use some examples cursorily early on to outline just the key components, the catalysts, how they function, and then we'll look in depth at The Invisible Man, the 2020 version. And when I say in depth, we will be spoiling the living daylights out of this movie. It's very good, and I recommend seeing it without knowing anything about it, if that's possible. So if you haven't seen that yet, and you don't want to be spoiled, and you want to enjoy the film for your first viewing, perhaps hold off on listening to this podcast. But that's about half an hour in, so up until that point, if you just want to learn the fundamentals, there you go. To close out the video, we'll be discussing some of the psychoanalytical components of horror and terror. In other words, how do the fears of horror and terror pertain to men and women historically, say in classic neo-Gothic novels, but also more modern pieces of media like Rosemary's Baby, The Witch House.
A game that we will provide a link to in the description so that you can check it out for yourself.
And there's some other pieces of media that we discuss as well, but those are the major players.
Sorry.
That's alright.
I lost my train of thought. So, at least in American media, horror is treated as a genre of its own, but it kind of encompasses many different forms of dealing with fear. But from what I understand, terror and horror aren't really the same thing, and is usually treated as terror as something very different from horror.
Yeah, they're distinct. Basically two sides of the same coin. In America, horror is everything, but in the Gothic, specifically British Gothic, horror and terror function very differently from each other. They're connected, but that type of distinction doesn't exist in the United States.
So that's why we don't really have a terror section alongside our horror section at the selecting movies or...
No. When it comes to media more generally, horror in America is sort of the go-to descriptor, but the principles remain in use, but people tend not to recognize them. And when the word terror is used, they might say terrifying or sometimes stories of terror. But in colloquial expression, terror, if it's used at all, means the same thing as horror. But academically speaking, they have very different functions.
Can you elaborate on what those functions are?
Ann Radcliffe was a Gothic novelist in the late 1700s. She wrote stories like The Romance of the Forest, The Mysteries of Udolpho, and The Italian. And after she stopped writing novels in the early 1800s, came up with a model to describe her mindset when writing her particular Gothic stories. And she described terror, the effects that it has on the reader, a reader who is terrified in her stories, is a result of their imagination being overstimulated by terrifying things that are hidden or obscure. A dark room or a figure who is mostly concealed. It could be photologically, meteorologically, rendering something as confusing or obscure, usually from a visual or sonic standpoint. Generally, Gothic stories tend to deal with that type of perspective. A character is looking at something that they can see or they can't see, or that they can hear or can't hear. I'm not saying that you don't have stories that don't have elements of smell or touch or something like that, but more often than not, confusion and obscurity relative to terror focus on sight and sound. Horror is the exact opposite. Horror annihilates imagination. It forces you to look directly at something so that you can't imagine it, wherein terror fills up one's imagination almost like a balloon full of air. Horror would have an emptying effect. Radcliffe described terror as activating the faculties of life and that it had sort of an exquisite, torturous effect, almost rapturous. Horror annihilates all of that. It has sort of a destructive or annihilating effect. Radcliffe's novels were generally terrifying, but her competitor, Matthew Lewis, his stories were generally horrifying. And in those days, there was a gendered component. Female stories were sort of relegated to imagination, to terrifying spaces, large Gothic castles that were dark and full of mist. And you could never really see the threat. It was hidden. What Radcliffe would refer to as armoring. There's always a sense of a buffer between you and the terrible menace, the dreaded evil. Matthew Lewis took the opposite approach. His horrifying stories, characters are constantly forced to look directly at abject things. The woman is forced to wake up in a cell. She was pregnant when she went down underneath the nunnery. These evil nuns lock her up and punish her by essentially burying her alive. When she wakes up, she subsists on water and bread and eventually gives birth to a child that she can't nurse, so it dies. And when she wakes up, her child is dead and rotting in her arms. So that would be a horrifying example. Radcliffe would never have something like that in her stories, or if she did, it would be delayed for as long as possible.
And you mentioned armoring, and for those listening, that's often in the form of like the protagonist conveniently faints just before the big reveal of
swooning.
Swooning, yeah.
Yeah, generally speaking, a Gothic heroine forced to look upon something that might do her harm would conveniently faint. And at the same time not be destroyed. Like, she would faint, and then the evil would vanish into the shadows again. Instead of taking her and devouring her or having its way with her, she would faint, she would wake up later and be safe. It's an oft-criticized storytelling device because it's a way of kind of extending the suspense. But it also highlights a defense mechanism relative to terrifying things, because more often than not, the horror is to look upon something that your mind can't handle. It annihilates, it destroys. You gaze upon Medusa or Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed by God's power, something like that, and the characters turn to stone, their eyes melt out of their head, they turn into a pillar of salt. And if it's not that literal in a biblical sense, it generally is not always a pleasurable experience in the same way. Oftentimes, stories, mystery stories, are relished for their ability to maintain a feeling of tension and suspense. And in Gothic stories, this is the concealment of the dreaded evil. Where is the killer? Who is the killer? The enjoyment from these stories, at least according to someone like Radcliffe, would be the terrifying components, the exquisite torture. And in her case, it's not so much it being a whodunit as the killer is near, I can feel their presence in the darkness or the mist. Matthew Lewis wouldn't really take the time to focus on that. He would constantly be bombarding the audience with images of the supernatural, of magic and gore and violence.
The abject.
Yeah, pretty much. And in America, people, when they think of horror, tend to think of slashers, sex, violence, zombies, things that at the same time tend to be described as schlocky, as campy, as cheap, whereas imagination has to be cultivated in a very careful manner. Even if it doesn't really make a lot of sense, in the case of Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho, there's the black veil. Behind this veil is something that the heroine, Emily St. Aubert, looks upon, but it's so horrifying that she faints. When she wakes, she can't quite recall what it was. She just feels its presence throughout the castle. And after she leaves the castle, it's called The Mysteries of Udolpho. Udolpho is the castle, and they only spend a fraction of the novel inside the castle. But long after they've left it, she's haunted by the image of whatever was behind the black veil. And after about 600 pages of wondering what it was, we are finally shown. Because our imagination is left to kind of percolate on whatever it was that she saw. we remain terrified in the Radcliffean sense. Lewis, he wouldn't waste any time with that. He would immediately jump into the horrifying components.
In terms of those components, what would be the markers, the sort of catalyst for these sort of traits?
In horror media, what Americans would refer to as horror media, and this could be a movie, it could be a video game, I would refer to it as Gothic media. The catalysts that Radcliffe outlines in her model are obscurity and confusion. There's also just the general visual components, or the audio-visual components. Sight and sound tend to go hand in hand, so if you don't have one, you're going to have the other. And in terrifying instances, you tend to see a lot less. Things will be kind of dark, and you can hear sort of sounds within the mist and the shadows. So the audio-visual components, and the obscurity and confusion, those would be sort of the catalysts. And depending on which arrangement of those you get, you'll have terror or horror. So consider a space, or the occupants within a space. So you have a house. A house is going to be portrayed very differently if you want to terrify the audience according to Radcliffe's model. A house is going to be vast, dark. There's going to be mist. If you've ever seen a Gothic heroine, or something equivalent to that, wandering through a dark, spooky castle with
just a lantern or candlestick.
A candelabra, that is a good representation of the terrifying space. You see enough to realize that you're within this great, massive, sort of cathedral-esque location, but as far as the dreaded evil goes,
there's a lot of space for it to be lurking.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Horror is the exact opposite. Things tend to be claustrophobic, but they're brightly lit. There are no opportunities for you to armor yourself in the Radcliffean sense of the word. There's no opportunity to faint. You're going to have to look. Mm-hmm. Also, a space in Gothic stories has morphological components. So the Gothic castle represents the psyche of the terrified heroine. Mm-hmm. It could be an actual building, but the nightmarish way that she interacts and moves through the space represents her own emotional struggles relative to some current predicament. Well, a horrifying space will treat the morphological components in a much more abject manner, where you could have walls that are made of bone and flesh, and they're oozing different fluids that we might not want to think about. Aliens. It looks like some form of secreted resin. Yeah, secreted from what? Being in the belly of the beast. But it's being shown to us in a very visual way. But it would also have sort of terrifying components, where the space would be kind of dark. Sometimes you could see just enough to have an inkling of the fact that you're in the belly of the beast. But you could also hear sound, heartbeats, growls, and other animalistic sounds that don't really sound like they should belong in a metallic industrial space. And the Nostromo kind of looks like it's made out of metal, but it sounds and feels
like a jungle, sort of.
A jungle, a giant monster.
Yeah.
That's generally how space is treated in terms of terror and horror. The vastness or the volume of the space, or the claustrophobic qualities, and then how well lit it is, how illuminated it is. And there's different ways that you can achieve that, but those are the basic sort of catalysts that you're looking for.
And sometimes the same space and a story can kind of oscillate between the two.
Yeah.
You know, the house might start out spooky, and then you find yourself in sort of an alternate. Silent Hill did a similar thing where there's like a nightmare version of the same setting that's very abject, but when you're put back into the quote-unquote normal side of things, it's still haunted. There's a sense of reversal or turning inside out. Resident Evil or Silent Hill or Poltergeist, anything like that, where you have a sense of the normal that is haunted with terrifying sensations, because the house is effectively
the black veil.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole point of a veil is to fail to contain what hides on the other side. It's shown just enough, it suggests what lies beyond. Well, you can turn that around and have the veil pulled back, and in something like Alien, the monstrous components begin to come forth, and they're apocalyptic, fire, smoke, bright, powerful lights, loud sounds, sort of a birthing, which also is tied into the fact that the ship is falling apart. Its ability to contain its own monstrous elements fails in its death throes. Whereas in Poltergeist, everything is a bit more suburban or domestic at the beginning of the film, and the types of things that you encounter are invisible or subtle. The mother is standing in the kitchen next to her daughter, and this chair just moves across the floor. Mm-hmm. You don't see what moves it, and there's a lot of imagination going on, even if you're looking at it directly in that case. Whereas at the end of the film, we learn that the bodies were never moved to the graveyard across town, and that they're still buried under the house, and these bodies push up through the earth. The coffins or the caskets open up, and the skeletons fall out. It's a very horrifying or abject depiction of things. So you have a terrifying beginning and a horrifying ending. And it's a very common way to sort of treat things from a narrative standpoint, where you have that climatic model, where you get up to a climatic moment and then you sort of the falling action before the epilogue at the very end. It's very common to start with terror and conceal the monster or the dreaded evil up until the big reveal. Aliens spends most of its runtime suggesting the alien queen beneath Hadley's Hope, and then there's the big reveal at the end. But from a presentational standpoint, not just the narrative arc of keeping it hidden, you're going to spend a certain amount of time showing and hiding and showing leading up to that big reveal. Basically little reveals, where you're going to show bits and pieces of the dreaded evil that you're dealing with. The concealment isn't total, even at the beginning of the film, or even stories that are known for their suspense have a habit of showing and teasing things enough so that you can actually see what you're dealing with. So the general approach of Halloween is to terrify Laurie Strode. It keeps things in the dark for the most part. But you'll have these horrifying moments. Or Michael Myers, you actually see Michael in his entirety when Laurie Strode looks through the window of the high school classroom. Michael is standing across the street by the station wagon looking at her. You get a full view of him in broad daylight. That's a horrifying component relative to a more terrifying general approach. Those are basically the catalysts that you're working in from a visual standpoint and a narrative standpoint. There are some other elements as well.
Right, so I mean, there's the physical obscurity of keeping something in the dark, or it's in another room and you just hear it. You could also have sort of a psychological obscurity as well. Exactly,
it's not just literal visuals. When you see the dark shadow across the room, it's terrifying because it's a dark shadow. It's obscured. But you know enough about it in a lot of these kinds of stories that you can at least recognize the threat. But then there's the identifying of the threat. So when you recognize it, you say, oh, well, that was a monster of some kind. But what is it actually? What is its identity? And this identity can be false in Scooby-Doo. The obscurity and the confusion that results in the terror only works for as long as you believe the ghost or the monster to be genuine. But the moment that they demask it and you realize that it's Old Man Willow underneath, and he would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for those meddling kids, then the terror dissipates, it vanishes. That's a very Radcliffean approach to things. It's called the explained supernatural. And in that case, the catalyzing elements, the obscurity, the confusion relative to the dreaded evil is in quotes. It's perceived as being what it actually isn't. And that moment of reveal, the horrifying moment, isn't horrifying because it disarms everything.
Mm.
Now, the opposite approach, where they go to take the mask off, and it's not actually a mask. The Hunchback of Notre Dame, when he's at the carnival, and Quasimodo is at the carnival, and they go to remove his mask, and it doesn't come off, and they realize that they're actually dealing with a monster. The Hunchback is human.
Mm.
He's a person, he's not an animal, and that story is about his struggle to sort of be viewed as human by other people. But, conversely, you could have a monster, like a vicious killer, a great destroyer, where you're like, don't worry, guys. I could picture Velma right now being like, well, it's obviously another old man wearing a monster outfit, and she goes to take off the mask, but there's no mask. There's no costume. It's actually a monster. And then just picture it picking her up off the ground and, I don't know, pulling her apart. Something like that. That would be a moment of actual horror. It destroys the imagining components because the monster, in a terrifying sense, is gone. The sense of the dreaded evil as imagined through a terrifying lens. That's gone because what you're dealing with instead is a monster that's directly in front of you. It's in the spotlight, but it remains a monster. In that moment, the horror isn't just the visual stuff, but the realization as Velma is being pulled apart, it's actually a killer. It's actually a monster. Your imagination is confirmed rather than refuted. And these are things that you can play around with in these stories as well. So you're not just dealing with something that you think is a monster but isn't. You can also have something that you think you saw that turns out to be real, and how you present that and how you show it can result in some different feelings of building up the imagination, emptying it, and what are you left with at the end? Are you left with an old man in a costume? Are you left with a monster? And if you're left with a monster, you can continue playing around with, do I keep hiding this thing? Or the cat is out of the bag, why bother? It's not uncommon in really effective stories to continue that sense of oscillation. Aliens, they get to the alien queen, they show her in all her majesty and glory. And you think to yourself, well, a common argument from a narrative standpoint is you want to keep the monster hidden for as long as possible, and that once you show it, it sort of loses all of its supernatural components. Like, until you meet the queen and you learn that she's actually just made of flesh and blood, she almost has a supernatural, quality of a very particular sort, almost like you're dealing with a ghost. Remember C.S. Lewis's model of the tiger versus the spirit? Until you can actually confirm that you're dealing with, say, a tiger in the other room, there is a tendency, when imagining something where you don't have a lot of information, to just view it as kind of nebulous. And that can have sort of an uncanny fear, where there's just not enough information. You're still afraid of whatever you're dealing with, but you don't know that it has claws or teeth or anything like that. But you still get the feeling that it can do you harm. But because it lacks the actual implements in your mind, you're left with a very specific type of reaction to it, like being afraid of a spirit. The uncanny is the result of having certain information on the face visually. Now take that same idea and just apply it to someone in a situation where they feel like they're under attack. And in that sense, what they're doing is they're creating a portrait or an image of the attacker in their mind. But if they don't have enough information, they're left with the attacker not having a face. A lot of threats in Gothic stories tend to be humanoid.
And have uncanny elements.
Yeah. The picture in your head is going to either be like a ghost or some kind of shape that looks kind of human, or you associate as somewhat human, even if it's just intelligent.
But going back to the example of the tiger, even when it's revealed and you're fully aware that it's a tiger, it's still threatening. But it's more of it's a menacing sort of threat, one of like imminent danger rather than a unsettling
immediate physical harm.
Right.
Like the tiger is going to eat you or it's going to maul you. Whereas terror and horror relative to something where you feel this sense of dislocated menace, like a menace that you can't attribute to something physically concrete like claws or teeth.
You just hear growling in the other room and it's unsettling, but you don't feel like you're in immediate danger.
You're in danger in an uncanny way,
yeah,
where you can't attribute it to like, or an immediate aggressor, or an aggressor that you can understand in a concrete way. You're just sort of in the presence of the atmosphere of something. You're under attack from an uncanny source in a way that's spatially arranged. And a lot of this has to do with the image in your head of what you're dealing with, because the creature can be inside the room or outside of the room. And that's another distinction I suppose we should make, is C.S. Lewis's model of the tiger versus the great spirit in the other room. That's dealing with things outside of the room. But you can also have the attacker inside the room. But imagine a terrifying space where you have a great chamber, or a chamber that through its size or its lack of light or an inconvenient amount of mist just everywhere is able to sort of make it as though the creature were outside of the room, i.e. not within your range of vision. And there's this lack of information where you hear this growl or this noise and you associate it with sounds of thunder, not of a tiger, but of like a mighty spirit, like a cloud or something like that, even though the creature is technically inside the room. And then you could take it a step further, that horrifying idea of space, where shrink the room and make it a bright light, but then keep the spirit anyways, and try and make it uncanny. A game like Silent Hill might do that, where you're stuck with Pyramid Head. You can see him, right? And he actually does have instruments of immediate physical harm.
It's like a giant knife.
And he has an apron.
Yeah.
And he has the body of a man, but his head is a pyramid. And not only that, it has kind of a Gothic pyramid at that, because it's made out of metal and it's a structure, but it's a dark structure. It may as well be covered in gargoyles. It feels uncanny with a touch of menace, combined with the other elements like the apron and his human body. He looks like a butcher. He's directly in front of you in a space that does not conceal him. And I think more often than not, isn't it in tight corridors where you kind of have to maneuver around him?
Yeah, there's the boss fight where you actually come head to head with Pyramid Head is a pretty tight space, which that big old knife has quite a bit of reach, so you have to kind of really sort of maneuver, kind of bait him into spaces, keep him on the far side of this confined space without getting hit. But yeah, as far as like the pyramid, or really a lot of the creatures in Silent Hill are humanoid in shape, but tend to lack eyes or an expressive face. Yeah,
there's a sense of the uncanny relative to how they're presented. And in that sense, the uncanny can be used within spaces that have horrifying and terrifying catalysts, which themselves tend to oscillate. I would say that something like Pyramid Head is partially horrifying and partially terrifying. He's horrifying because he's effectively a butcher, and he's going to butcher you. But he's also terrifying, that special fear that C.S. Lewis called dread, that you would normally associate with a great spirit outside of the room. Well, there is a sense of beyond. There is a sense of obscurity and concealment in a terrifying way relative to Pyramid Head, where even though he's directly in front of you, even though it's a claustrophobic space where you're forced to confront him and effectively maneuver around him, there's no way to get past him. there's still some terrifying stuff going on, even though you think that wouldn't be the case, because there's no mist, it's brightly lit. Mm-hmm. You can still use uncanny to create terrifying effects in a situation that would normally be horrifying, abject. Well, because of the uncanny, you can reverse that. And these types of things also tend to oscillate. And then there are some of the other Gothic components that we've talked about, the hauntological, the abject, where you could have a situation that might normally be terrifying, for instance, but the moment you start to introduce abject components, imagine a dark hallway where it is poorly lit, but then you are given enough light to look upon something wherein you realize, oh my god, the floor is made out of human flesh. Doom is a good example of that. There will be levels in the game where you encounter these walls of flesh. It's a horrifying moment in what would otherwise be described as a Gothic castle with these dark, poorly lit chambers, but you can experience the opposite of what you might expect thanks to some of these devices. And a lot of authors will sort of make a career out of choosing which effect they want to inflict. Matthew Lewis was famous for being a horrifying auteur, the horrifying side to Radcliffe's model. And Radcliffe herself was the opposite. If Radcliffe was known for terror, she still included bits of horror. It seems like it would be very concrete, just in terms of, okay, if you have a dark room and a big wide open space, the creature is hidden. It must be terrifying. Well, if you introduce a little bit of the abject, for instance, suddenly it's horrifying.
Well, it also comes to mind in this sort of obscuring the menace would be like in the game Amnesia. I remember there are parts where you're in a flooded corridor and there's something coming after you and you can see its movements through the water, but the creature itself is invisible.
Yeah, it's the Forbidden Planet approach to literally being invisible.
Yeah.
And Amnesia, The Dark Descent, does that literal sense of invisibility, and it also has that photological approach, where there is something that isn't impervious to your senses, but it's concealed by darkness. But that specific boss fight is a fun example of something that is concealed, even though it is in the room. I remember playing that, mm-hmm. and you have to jump from box to box. There are these boxes or these corpses floating in the water, and basically don't touch the water because the monster is in the water, and if you do, it'll get you. And it's kind of an outrageous scene, but you're having a terrifying response anyways. And for me, being able to sort of tap into that and being able to maintain a sense of, what do they call that? To
suspend your disbelief?
Suspend, yeah. Being able to suspend my disbelief in this scene and to entertain the fact that, okay, I'm dealing with this invisible threat. I don't dismiss that right off the bat. That sort of demonstrates an example of, in order for the scene to work, you have to believe that the creature is in the room with you, that it's invisible. The Invisible Man, the movie we just watched, the 2020 version of the film, in order for that scene the scenes with the invisible thing to work, we have to adopt the same mindset as the woman who's being gaslit by a man who's in a suit. Mm-hmm. That movie's kind of clever because it is a guy in a suit that actually makes him invisible, but she's experiencing it in a somewhat supernatural way. With a lack of information, it becomes otherworldly, it becomes uncanny. You have objects lifting off the table and floating around. A knife, the menacing object, where it's in plain sight, but what's holding it? In Amnesia, The Dark Descent, what's in the water? Your survival response in situations like that almost becomes like a child's. And Amnesia, The Dark Descent, oh, quick, don't touch the water, the floor is lava.
Yeah.
That's a very childlike kind of response to something. And in The Invisible Man, you have this woman who's acting like she's afraid of ghosts. And honestly, you wouldn't have to change much about the story for it to become a ghost story. She's a... go ahead.
Oh, well, I mean, like, they start out pretty much before she's quote-unquote haunted, saying that the man in question is dead.
Yeah. Yeah. And is he dead? Is he not dead? So there's a sense of the explained supernatural mystery. There's the Scooby-Doo elements of it, the guy in a suit. But the effects that we feel, the catalyzing elements, there's this ambiguity as to whether or not it's actually a ghost or not. Mm. And the woman knows in her hearts of hearts that he's still alive, but she's acting as though she's dealing with a spirit. And then when you see something like the knife in the restaurant where it lifts up off the table, she doesn't see it, but her sister does, but too late, the knife flies across the room as quick as lightning and cuts her sister's throat. And then she's framed, and she has to try and explain what it is, but nobody believes her because, well, it's just absurd. Mm-hmm. But it turns out to actually be real. And in this case, it's a story about science, like mad science, about murderous men hiding invisibly in broad daylight. Until you're given that information, you think that you're dealing with a spirit. Or you're thinking you're dealing with like a half-spirit that holds real-world objects.
In order to defeat him, she would need to pretty much dispel his...
power.
Yes.
And where does his power come from? Making her think that she's mad through the instruments of terror and horror. Because effectively, that movie, The Invisible Man, is a vehicle where the woman is being subjected to the machinations of the tyrant, who makes her think that he's dead so that she believes, just through these sort of gut reactions to horror and terror as he presents them, in some very nuanced ways, that he's attacking her from beyond the grave. Automatically, that makes her more vulnerable. It's a psychological attack. But at the end of the film, she knows what's up. She realizes, okay, he's not a ghost. His brother is dead, so he can't be in two places at once. Mm-hmm. And she uses his own technology against him to come out on top. And she's freed from the spell, the terrifying, horrifying sort of grand guignol that he's put her through the entire movie. And to its credit, that movie is able to maintain it from beginning to end. But it does kind of change a little bit. Mm-hmm. Because at the start of the film, it starts off more terrifying. The attacker attacks or strikes from the shadows. And then towards the end of the film, he's in front of us. But he's still invisible, so there are kind of these uncanny, confusing elements. There's a sense of ambivalence. You're like, okay, I'm in a room. It's brightly lit, claustrophobic hallway in a asylum. And these guards are being taken out one by this menace. And you're watching them being thrown about in a very physical kind of way. Like they're being shot, they're being maimed, being beaten up. The effect isn't just, well, okay, it's discreetly terrifying and horrifying. So that's just another dimension to the villain's attack. And in his case, it's such a complex attack that he actually needs an accomplice to pull it off. Mm-hmm. And all of this technology.
Well, and also, in the case of the villain, even when his mask is off, so to speak, when he's not being physically obscured by his device, mm-hmm. he still maintains a constant mask of sincerity in his interactions.
Yeah, that's actually my favorite moment in the movie. He has a world-class poker face. Mm-hmm. And at that point, he's the man behind the curtain, and he's been had out. But because he's able to sort of defend himself in these final moments by saying, look, it's all in your head, he's continuing to play the game. But at this point, he doesn't realize that the woman has overcome his fear. She's gotten through his haunted house. And she's come out stronger in a way that he's not able to realize until it's too late. And at that point, she's no longer the bride running into the forest, dressed in white, just kind of lost and confused. Like, she also has a poker face and kills him and is effectively a better performer than him in that type of situation. And she utilizes the same tricks that he does. And at the end of the film, on one hand, we're kind of celebrating the fact that she was able to come out on top, but she's dressed in black. She is a murderer and a liar, just like him. And
has his tools of the trade.
Yeah, and she's been taught.
Yeah.
And at that point, she's become a very active, autonomous agent in her own destiny, except it's been molded by her former master, the Dominator, this ex-husband who's now dead. And the horrifying component from a narrative standpoint and a visual standpoint is her standing there in the darkness. And that's another thing that can be horrifying, is when we realize that what we're dealing with is still a monster. You think, okay, is she pure at this point? No. And the brother in the film, the police officer, realizes that she's a murderer, but she's able to bend him to her will. So she's kind of taken on the role that her former husband used to hold. Now she's the one with power. She's the one with agency. Remember the music that's playing at the end of that, where it's kind of, it doesn't sound happy, really. It sounds kind of malevolent, but glorious. So there's a sense of rejoicing. The fact that it's a profoundly fucked up situation. That's another way that horror is commonly used to drive home the fact that, okay, when you're forced to look at something, you have a horrifying conclusion. The terror is sort of the opposite of that. Imagine this sense of foreboding. You're cultivating a feeling, and then there's either a twist at the end where you're like, oh, I think she's going to be able to make do, get through the situation. But at the end, she's just as bad as him.
Well, as she slayed the evil king just to don his crown.
Exactly. That's like so incredibly Gothic. I can't even begin to really describe it. But you'll notice that to present that to the audience, you have to present it visually, wherein it's not just vicarious for us, because we become invested in these characters, and at the end, we think we have it figured out, or we think, all right, this is going to work out in a way that doesn't make us feel sort of empty or annihilated by the realization that she is the new tyrant. You're terrified by what she's dealing with. Is her sense of self going to survive? And you feel kind of threatened by the presence of something that could possess her, take her over. But the moment of horror is when you realize that despite the hope that you had that she might, remain pure, armoring, right? Self-delusion. You think, I'm putting my trust into this character too, when she's not pure at all. She's a survivor. What did Ash say? I admire its purity. A survivor, unclouded by conscience, remorse, or delusions of morality. And in his case, he was referring to the xenomorph in Alien, which is this humanoid kind of monster, the phallic monster. The invisible woman. She's become the tyrant. She's become the phallic woman, essentially. In the 17 and 1800s, power, destruction, things like that were generally masculine. So if something was phallic, if something was destructive, if it had agency, it was more often associated as manly. But older sort of stories would refer to this ancient, archaic mother, right? Which would have phallic components. And that's just another, horrifying thing. Whereas terror, from that narrative standpoint, is just being afraid that she might turn into the monster. But the moment of emptying, where you're just kind of struck dumb, is like, wow, she is. There's also a sense of celebration or attraction with that.
Well, yeah, you could definitely use that as, extrapolate it as a, in stories of female monsters and mythologies, there's a fear that the oppressed will become the oppressor. That there'll be a feminist uprising that will overthrow the patriarchal society, where in this case it's just a very small-scale version in a way.
Yeah, it's a sense of individual liberation that is nonetheless contagious, because even though it's horrifying at the end, you're meant to root for the heroine. When she gets away with murder, you're meant to celebrate it, even if it is kind of horrifying, even if they don't hide the fact that she's treacherous when she does it. You can't blame her, because she's the subject of patriarchal abuse, and she's been able to escape it by beating the tyrant at his own game. And there's a sense of liberation with that, where horror and terror are instruments to kind of drive the story forward. They're meant to make us move in one direction or the other, and then when the story sort of plays out the way that it does, Gothic triumph tends to be checkered. You're not just going to have, like, this person coming out on the other end clean. Except in Radcliffean stories you would, where they tend to be more pure. The woman doesn't have autonomy in those stories. She has to be rescued by someone. But in a story like that, The Invisible Man, she's doing all the rescuing herself. She tries to get help from other people. They don't believe her because she's just a crazy woman. But at the end of the story, you realize that she's rescued herself. But to do that, you have to become the monster. But notice how there's a sense of shackling with that, where you think you're free, right? But if part of the binding of us to these Gothic situations is just the fact that they're horrifying or terrifying, she's not entirely free, because her hands are stained with blood. She is a monster at that point, and that will be with her for the rest of her life. And she's liberated herself from the tyrant's subjugation, but she's not free from the trauma. She's going to walk away from that with, like, scars.
And I think that's often a running theme with stories involving terror and horror, that the little glimpses of moments of horror tend to leave, if not physical scars, sort of a psychological taint.
Yes, absolutely. They tend to have lasting damage.
Which makes the moments of terror in between the moments of horror that much more terrifying.
Because you anticipate being branded. If I look at this, I will be affected in a way that I cannot undo. I will be stained. But notice how there's that kind of increases or augments the desire to look, which leads to irreparable damage more often than not. That game you showed me today, The Witch's House, is a champion example of that, where you have these moments of horror and terror that guide the protagonist through the story. And you want to survive. You want to get to the end. You want to master it and look and find the truth. Does the truth set you free? No, it doesn't. And I'm almost hesitant to even spoil that one. And I feel like we should just leave a link for it in the description of the video.
Yeah, that'd be a good idea.
And I invite our listeners to watch that. It's about an hour and a half long, but it's...
Or play it.
Or play it.
Better yet.
Absolutely.
We could link that.
Yeah, definitely. And the trauma of the past is sort of fixed on a new subject. And how that works with someone whose mind is sort of... They're terrified of that, but they're also driven to basically pull a Velma and be like, all right, my imagination is going crazy and I'm built up with all this pent-up energy. I need to release it. Lay on Macduff, and damned be he who cries hold enough. Off with the fucking veil. When you pull it aside, either it's tame, like, oh wow, I spent this whole time being afraid of what was behind the veil, which is the point.
Yeah.
Or I should have not done that, and now there's no way to undo it, and that's the ultimate sort of horror.
Oh, yeah. You can't unsee that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm going to be stuck with that for the rest of my life. I'm happy when a story can affect me like that, because the vicarious quality to stories like this is that even though they touch us and they affect us in a Gothic way, like The Witch House, with the really wonderful ending, no matter how horrifying or terrifying it is separate from ourselves. Mm-hmm. Even though we project onto the characters, it's able to affect us in a very profound way that has lasting effects without actually damaging us. It's affected us. That's a very skillful thing. If an author can do that, like The Invisible Man or The Witch House or some of these other games that have a lasting impact, where you relish them for their terrifying components and you dread or fear the lasting impact of the horror. Because the horror is what sticks with you, but the terror is something that you relish as well.
Right, and I seem to remember a statement from the YouTuber Markiplier early on in his career, when he was playing like Amnesia and a few like indie horror games. But he made a comment that like the games that affect him the most are the ones that make him not want to proceed, to go forward.
Exactly.
Because it's just too, like, it's not the possibility of game over. You can restart the game.
Exactly.
But it's just, it rattles you so much that it just psychologically, you have to force yourself to keep going.
Sure. Yeah, it's either terrifying or it's traumatized you enough already that you're like, okay, you feel like there's more. Even if the thing that you've experienced is really awful, you feel like there's something beyond it. And there's a sense of recursive trauma, recursive terror, recursive horror, where there's an oscillation between the two. That sense of a never-ending sort of torment. But the weird thing about us humans, consumers of Gothic media, that's what keeps us coming back. We want that because, again, going back to the notion of atmosphere as rapturous, you want to be annihilated. You want to be tortured exquisitely, terrified and horrified in the Radcliffean sense. You want that. And being put through these stories, the ones that work, is you'll notice that they're not original stories, but they come from older stories. Like The Invisible Man was, of course, a remake of an older story that goes all the way back to the castle of Otranto. The patriarch chasing the woman around the castle because he wants her to have his baby. That was sort of the core conflict in The Invisible Man. He knows that you're pregnant with his child, that's why he doesn't kill you. But he's torturing you to kind of subjugate you.
And once you know that the protagonist is safe from death from the antagonist, but you don't know what the next target's going to be. There's an orbit of chaos and destruction around her anywhere she goes because he's destroying everything she holds dear.
Yeah, very Frankensteinian. The creature to Victor says, I will glut the maw of death with those that you love until daylight is unbearable to you, until you lose the will to live or to function. You become mine. I dominate you. That sense of power, of mastery, relative to sort of beating down your target's defenses with terror and horror. But then there are also, for us, the audience, that's a pleasurable thing. It doesn't always feel pleasurable because you feel horrified or terrified. There is a sense of paradox there. But anyone who loves that type of material is absolutely at home with it. They want to experience that. I mean, when you watch The Shining, you want to feel the uncanny, even though it is a confused, ambivalent, sinister response, where you feel as though you're on the receiving end of something unpleasant, but that in and of itself is pleasurable.
And I think many who enjoy Gothic media, much like the protagonists in many cases, just can't help themselves in pulling back the veil more and more to see what's behind. The curiosity is just too strong.
And that's what happens to Emily St. Aubert in The Mysteries of Udolpho, presented with the black veil. Not a dainty little white veil with lace and bunnies and hearts on it, but a black veil. You want to look behind it, even though you know that there's some sense of a dreaded evil. Is it actual? Is it fake? Is it counterfeit? Who knows? But there's a sense of wanting to look. And, oh, but what if you'll be destroyed, your terrifying mind says? What if it is truly horrifying? And that in and of itself is a weird kind of pleasure. And, of course, Radcliffe would spend the whole novel as basically foreplay to a final sort of terrifying moment, that final, like, jouissance. It almost has an orgasmic quality in her case. Whereas Lewis was kind of the opposite approach. Skip the foreplay, just get straight to the dirty stuff. It's interesting how horror and terror can just apply to, okay, how do you shoot a scene in like a movie or a video game? How do you set the stage? But then also, how do you relate to what you're looking at? And in a Gothic way, a narrative way, what does the story mean to us as the audience? More often than not, women, when they watch some of these stories, there's a sense to sort of communicate an underlying message. Because who's terrified or gaslit in these stories more than anyone else? It's generally an isolated woman.
Like Rosemary's Baby, for example,
yes.
is like the ultimate example of that.
Yeah.
Horror.
Being threatened with pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
Alien. Ripley being threatened with alien impregnation. That, of course, can have horrifying or terrifying components because the fears associated with horror and terror relate to specific fears. It could be pregnancy. It could be live burial. It could be murder. And sometimes those tend to bleed into each other as well, because you'll notice that in a story like Rosemary's Baby, it's a rapacious pregnancy. She's raped by the devil.
Mm-hmm.
But of course there's a twist at the end where she learns to love the child and she hates her husband. Everything around her is false except for the child. And you can play around with that as well. Because horror and terror will present it in a way where you think on one side of the equation, or the veil, you think, oh, this is what I had in mind. Well, once you're on the other side, it's almost like you're a different person. It changes your way of thinking relative to these things that, under normal circumstances, one would think people have fairly concrete opinions of, like pregnancy, being raped by the devil.
Mm.
Like, oh, well, that's nothing but a horrible experience. But in Rosemary's Baby, it actually has a pretty substantial silver lining, because she realizes that her husband was a horrible man the entire time. It's not a pleasant experience. It's a really awful thing. There's no way to disguise that. But at the end of the film, Coleridge would say she's sad but wiser. There's an educating component. And you might argue that in a certain way, she's better off knowing.
Well, she's psychologically tormented through the entire film.
Yeah.
But not by the devil. It's people around her.
Exactly. And at the end, she walks through the doorway, hidden behind the wardrobe, and is able to see. And she's horrified, but the spell ends. And in one sense, she's liberated. In another, she remains shackled. She is the devil's concubine.
Mm-hmm.
She's stuck raising the Antichrist. But she's able to have kind of a Sisyphean response to it. She laughs at the gods, basically.
And, I mean, pregnancy is an excellent tool for terror, because there's a natural obfuscation. You can't see the child,
yes.
So the whole time you don't know if it's a monstrosity or not, but it's there lingering until its birth.
It's also something that you can relate to, where you think it's human, but it also has parasitic qualities and the horrifying components, or the abject components that you respond to with horror, tend to reveal things about ourselves where we are stuck. Women are expected to give birth, and there are powerful forces at work, patriarchs, tyrants, those that work in the shadows, that are forcing them to have children and give birth. And that's sort of an underlying theme that's communicated through these horrifying and terrifying stories.
Mm-hmm.
The twists and turns, the architecture is all meant to communicate fears for women specifically of childbirth. And there are male fears, but they tend to be in response to either things that can cut you to pieces or a distant, archaic sort of female threat. In Gothic stories, female means more than just woman. It also means other. It also means death, infantilization, or old age. To look upon a woman in a horrifying sense is to look upon Medusa or something like that. And that's like the male point of view. Because men they can't get pregnant, for instance. And if these stories are about women being chased through castles due to fears of pregnancy and all the terror and horror that results from that, how's a man going to respond to that? A male and female audience is going to look upon the same images and things, but how they respond to it is at least informed by who they are as people before they sit down to watch anything. And that can be kind of fun, too.
So that's horror and terror, which will be a strong theme in following videos as it runs. It's a backbone, really, of Gothic media. From this point forward, we've covered all the core elements, so we can get down to some of the more specific themes and tropes.
We'll kind of be using the devices that we've talked about more generally as we talk about media on an individual basis. So, for instance, if we watch a particular horror film or we play a particular game, we can take some of the devices that we've talked about in previous podcasts and use them to sort of dissect whatever we're looking at.
Right, well, thanks for joining us on our exploration of horror and terror.
Until next time, take care.
Bye.